In this video, we're going to continue our discussion with hypothesis testing. We're going to look at what are we actually wanting our outcomes to look like, okay? So the purpose of hypothesis testing is to determine how likely it is that the null hypothesis is true. So what we do is we begin with assuming that the null hypothesis is true. That's the value that we're looking at. Recall back with our peanut butter jars. We assume that it's 32 ounces because that's what the label says. And so we want to see if that is true or not. So we're going to assume that the null hypothesis is true. If data provides strong evidence against the null hypothesis, we reject it and believe that the alternative hypothesis is true. So either the null hypothesis is going to be true or we are going to reject it and the alternative hypothesis is being true. Now we have to be a little bit careful because of the fact that we never want to state that something is absolutely true. Think about a court of law. A court of law, when we go in as a jury or anything like that, we never state that the accused is innocent. We say that they're guilty or they're not guilty. Same thing here. We're going to say that there is either enough evidence to reject or not reject the null hypothesis. We're never really going to say that absolutely this is true, absolutely this is false. We just don't have enough evidence to look at it, okay? So if there is sufficient evidence, and we're talking about that sufficient evidence as far as our hypotheses and looking at whether or not something actually falls in there or not, if there's sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis, we conclude that the alternative hypothesis is true because we've got enough evidence. In a court of law, you have enough evidence to say that that person is guilty. Okay? If there is not sufficient evidence, so we don't have enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis, then we conclude that the null hypothesis might be true. We don't know that it is. We never conclude that the null hypothesis is true. Again, court of law. There's sufficient evidence, so the person is guilty. There's not sufficient evidence, they are not guilty. But we never said that they were innocent. We just said that they're not guilty. We don't have enough evidence is what it's looking at. With hypothesis testing, there are two types of errors that can occur, just like in a court of law, okay? So type 1 error is going to be that we reject the null hypothesis when it is actually true. Let me get that erased here. So when it is true. And I'm going to show you a little diagram and put this also in court of law terms for us, so don't panic at this moment. Type 2 error is when we do not reject the null hypothesis when it is false. Okay, so I'm going to look at our decisions, and we have the decisions to either reject the null hypothesis or do not reject the null hypothesis. So those are our two decisions that we can make. Okay. Our possible outcomes is that the null hypothesis is true, or the null hypothesis is false. And so looking at this, again, this is a little bit difficult for us to kind of understand a little bit. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to look at the court of law. We can either find the person guilty or not guilty. And it might help if I were to spell correctly. Okay. And the possibilities, this is how we find them, or our verdict, that's better. Let's say that this is our verdict. Well, reality is that they are not guilty. So they're innocent, actually. Let me do it that way. That they're innocent, or they're guilty. Okay, so these are the possible outcomes when we're talking about the court of law. So looking at this, in the court of law, if they're guilty, and we find them guilty, that is a correct decision. So we came back with the correct verdict. If they're innocent, we should come back with a not guilty verdict. So that would be the correct decision on that case. If the person is innocent and we actually find them guilty, that is what we call a type 1 error. We have made a type of error. That's a type 1. We rejected the null hypothesis when it was true. So we sent them to jail when they were actually innocent. A type 2 error is when we did not reject them, we found them not guilty when they were actually guilty. So we use this same concept over here with hypothesis testing. If the null hypothesis is true, our correct decision is to not reject it. If our null hypothesis is false, our correct decision would be to reject it because it's false. And then with our types of errors, we have the type 1 error and the type 2 error. And so you can look at this again with hypothesis testing or the court of law type thing, but when we reject it, that's a false. We do not reject it, that means that we're saying that the null hypothesis is true. And we'll get into some examples of this in future videos. So I want you to look at the concept of rejecting or not rejecting and these types of errors. Try to get those identified, and then let me know if you have any questions.